you very much for the floor. Good afternoon. 20 languages, no, sorry, 21 languages to go. I suppose I could say something in Croatian, but not very much. Tomáš outlined his own position, and I think it's only fair that I should do something similar. As long as I've been sort of conscious politically, I've been generally in favour, sometimes very strongly in favour of European integration. A very, very long time ago, I spent a year at the College of Europe in Bruges, great brainwashing, you might say. And it's really been my 8.5 years in the European Parliament that sort of started a questioning in my mind. I think on balance, I'm still in favour of membership, I'm still in favour of integration, but I really want to look at the small print nowadays much more carefully before voting with an unequivocal yes. And I'm definitely against Hungary joining the euro at this stage. We have an obligation, of course, with the Treaty of Accession, but I don't think we should hurry. But that's a separate issue, we can come back to that. Now, what I want to say is that what I see, partly from Brussels, partly from here, partly from other places that I visit, is that the European project is in a really major crisis. And while the actors see some of the factors, I'm not sure that the really fundamental ones have been identified. Most people, much of what one reads, see the crisis in economic terms. There is indeed an economic crisis. I would be the first to agree with this. But together with the economic crisis, I think there is a political crisis, a sociological crisis, and for those of you who've done some work on political theory, an epistemological crisis, which I will come on to some of these anyway. Now, basically, and Tamás wrote a very interesting blog entry recently, only available in Hungarian. It's in the blog, Tagok vagyunk, in which you said that it's to do with Hungarian modernity. I'm not quoting you perfectly or precisely here. Now, it seems to me that your assumption is, and that's the EU assumption, is that there is a single model of modernity. There is only one way of being modern. And I think this is the starting point, and this is what I would question. And if you look at the world, if you look at Europe, if you look at other parts of the world, there are many modernities. And that's where I would differ from quite a lot of people in saying, well, if there is a French modernity and a German modernity, and those of you who know France and Germany know perfectly well how very different they are, why not a Hungarian modernity? It's not going to be very different, but it's going to be different in some respects. And crucially, what the Commission, and here I accept, you listen to the Commission, well, my déformation professionnelle is Parliament, so our perspectives, to some extent, are both affected by the institutions and they're dealing with, is that actually it's the one-size-fits-all perspective of the Commission, that there is only one way of doing things. You might say, not unreasonably, that this way is argued out in Council, to some extent in Parliament. This is true, but on the other hand, I think much of the regulation that starts out from the Commission almost certainly superfluous. And I'll come on to some of the dimensions, some of the problems that this has given rise to. Now, what I want to argue here, I haven't got time to go into great detail, so to some extent I'm asserting, is that what we have today, very different, and I think you would agree with this, Tomáš, the European project that we have today is very different from what it was in 2004, and unbelievably different from, let's say, 1957 when the Rome Treaty was signed. The accumulation of power in Brussels has basically created something like a semi-imperial site of power. That is to say, it is an imperial centre with subordinate peripheries. Those of you who know post-colonial theory will understand what I'm talking about. There are disparities of power. And what I see, just a footnote, that post-colonial theory is a left-wing theory, by the way, but there's no reason why I shouldn't appropriate it. as you will see, I'm on your right. This side, I'm on your left, but you can ignore that. And it seems to me that if we look at this entire project from the perspective, among other things, of power, then what we see is the steady accumulation of power. You all know about the acquis communautaire. This is the rule book of the European Union. When we joined in 2004, it was 80,000 pages. I think by now it's up to 120,000 pages. The 80,000 pages, by the way, is probably in the language which takes up least space. Think about it, not all languages are not all the same size or length. And the most concise language of the European Union, by the way, is Swedish. The least concise is Greek. Not because the Greeks are more verbose, but the Greek alphabet takes up more space on the page. And I don't know about Cyrillic in Bulgarian, but I haven't looked. So I'm assuming that the point I'm making is obvious, that a steady growth, a steady enlargement not just of Europe, but of the legislation that the states of Europe, members of states of the European Union, must abide by if they are to be accepted as European. We can go into all sorts of things here about to what extent, in what way each country implements the EU legislation, but the fact is that they do have to implement it. There's no argument. Now, the difficulty that I see is that if we're talking about power, a site of power, to use this technical word, then we're talking about politics. But how do you engage politically with the European Commission? The European Commission puts its arguments forward in legal, in technocratic, in neutral language, and apolitically. You, as citizens of the European Union, have really no power, or very little power, to affect what the European Union, in the form of the Commission, does. You can vote for me. That's a good step in the right direction. The European Parliament does have some power. The Citizens' Initiative, very cumbersome instrument, but still is something. That's about it. You know, when did you last have the opportunity to question a commissioner? And the answer is never. The commissioners do come along to the European Parliament and give totally evasive answers. I've had opportunity to deal with quite a few. It's amazing how they sidestep questions, and I haven't time to give you illustrations of it. So what I'm saying is that we have a site of power with a great deal accumulation of power, and there's nothing that you as citizens can really do about it. I think this creates a political vacuum, and indeed what it does create is a form of depoliticized space, anti-politics, if you like. But we're talking about democracy, aren't we? Now, I was very impressed at the end of the Portuguese presidency, I think it was in 2008, you remember these dates better than I do. The then Portuguese Prime Minister, José Sócrates, came along and said, democracy is a part of Europe's DNA. I wish I'd said that. Oh, it's wonderful. So we have this European democracy, and then there's this so-called democratic deficit. So what kind of a democracy are we talking about? On top of which, can you have a democracy without a demos? The actual subject of democracy? That's you and we up here, but we don't constitute a single entity. I think it's fair to say that very few of us are particularly interested in what they do in Portugal. What do you know about politics in Estonia or Sweden? And the answer is very little. I think the only time the people of Europe come together is in the Eurovision Song Contest. But not what I would call very political. There's no European political consciousness, let's be honest about it. So you have this strange beast, a democracy without a demos. I know I'm beginning to sound like a populist, but I think this is a genuine piece of political analysis. Now, I want to make one point, and then I'll stop because I'm ready to talk for 10 minutes. What I think has happened in Europe in the last 15, 18, 20 years, last 2 decades, let's say, is the emergence of a liberal consensus. What I would add here is that this insight is not mine. It comes from somebody who's very, 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 very far from on the left from me, a Belgian working in the United Kingdom called Chantal Mouffe. I do know her personally. I don't accept all her argument, but I think in identifying the liberal consensus, which she attacks from the left, I think she's absolutely right. The elites in Europe are overwhelmingly permeated by this single vision, single liberal consensual vision of the world. And if you think about it, when I was young, democracy had various forms. Today we only speak about liberal democracy. Where's Christian democracy? Where's social democracy? Where is national liberalism? Etc., etc. And what the liberal consensus has done is to marginalize, to exclude, to subject to political exclusion those who do not agree with it. They are called populists, they are called extremists. But in reality, what I think we're seeing, and this is not just a Hungarian phenomenon, is various social forces trying to claw their way back into politics. I see my colleagues in the European Parliament in UKIP. They are really worth watching. I mean, they're hugely amusing. They provoke whenever they can. Well, you know, they may very well end up with 20% of the vote in the United Kingdom. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, something like the same. This Sweden Democrats may very well do extremely well in the Swedish elections next year. This is not Hungary. This is a Europe-wide problem, a revolt from the periphery. There are the left-wing extremists, there I call them that. Think about my parliamentary colleague, whom I don't know at all, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who got 10% or so in the French presidential elections. The French extreme left and extreme right, that's to say Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen, also a parliamentary colleague of mine, are now polling over 50%. Now, at that point, which is the centre and which is the periphery? So I'm saying there's a Europe-wide crisis because I think large growing forces in Europe do not accept the view that the only way of being democratic is this liberal democracy, with which I don't have too many problems, but it's narrowing in its focus. The Commission has very largely accepted the assumptions of liberal democracy. Now, let me bring this, I'm sure we'll continue to argue, but let me bring this to a close, because this is where Hungary comes in. Those who do not obey the dictates of the liberal consensus are vilified. And this, in a sense, is what the Hungarian government has been doing for the last 3 years. It's gone off on its own. And people who deviate, and I think being a deviant country is really a very interesting concept indeed, because at that point you're saying that what the people of that country want cannot be democratic because it deviates from the liberal norm. I'm sorry, this is not democracy for me. This is something else. But actually that's the world we live in. And I think this is the, if you like, the Hungarian dimension of the Europe-wide crisis with which I began, and I've spoken for 15 minutes, which is a little longer than I intended, so thank you for your attention so far.